Robert E. Lee's campaign in Maryland ended in disaster. The Battle of Antietam left his army severely weakened, and had George McClellan pressed the advantage with any determination, Lee's forces might have been annihilated. However, McClellan, preoccupied with his own exaggerated fears of Lee's supposed numerical superiority, wasted the opportunity. As Lee retreated into Virginia, he focused on rebuilding his shattered army and preparing for the winter, unaware that President Abraham Lincoln had no intention of granting him respite. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, where the conflict continues to rage, bringing Robert E. Lee into dramatic, yet strategically inconclusive, confrontations with Union forces at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Ever wondered why so many viewers on YouTube and Patreon support us? We release 2 exclusive videos each week, along with other perks such as early access, voting rights on upcoming content, private Discord access, and a full release schedule. Join us via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under this video. Your support enables us to produce 3 free videos per week while ensuring fair compensation for our team. Thank you for making this possible. As war engulfed the American continent, Europe watched with strategic interest. Both Britain and France sought to leverage the conflict for their own advantage. Reliant on Southern cotton, neither nation severed ties with the Confederacy outright following its secession. The South, aware of this, actively sought formal recognition. However, Lincoln made it clear that such recognition would be tantamount to a declaration of war against the United States, forcing Britain and France to maintain an official stance of neutrality. France, seizing the opportunity presented by America's inability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, embarked on an imperial venture in Mexico, removing itself from Lincoln's immediate concerns. Meanwhile, Spain took advantage of the situation to reclaim the Dominican Republic. Britain, however, remained the most pressing diplomatic challenge. The French sought British leadership in recognizing the Confederacy, and London seemed willing to oblige. Many of Britain's aristocrats and cabinet ministers sympathized with the Southern planter class, and Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, viewing the United States as a geopolitical rival, saw an opportunity to weaken it. His strategy mirrored his approach to European power struggles, balancing Lincoln against Jefferson Davis for Britain's benefit, while discreetly supporting France's Mexican intervention. Neutralizing Palmerston's ambitions required shifting the war's focus to the issue of slavery. British workers, strongly opposed to slavery, refused to process Southern cotton, even when this stance contributed to a recession in the textile industry. As long as the Union fought merely to preserve itself, Palmerston could use the Confederacy as diplomatic leverage without facing domestic backlash. However, if the war became explicitly about ending slavery, any attempt to assist the South would provoke mass unrest in Britain, something Palmerston could not afford. Meanwhile, enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines in increasing numbers, leaving individual Union commanders to determine their fate. Most followed General Benjamin Butler's Fort Monroe Doctrine, which argued that since the Confederates claimed to be a separate nation, the Fugitive Slave Act no longer applied. Instead, escaped slaves were classified as contraband of war and enlisted as laborers, often with pay. Though Lincoln disliked the doctrine's implicit recognition of secession, he saw the practical and moral benefits of undermining the Southern economy by depriving it of enslaved labor. Lincoln also sought to formally authorize emancipation through federal arms, but he needed a significant military victory to avoid making the proclamation appear as an act of desperation. Antietam was not the decisive triumph he desired, but it sufficed. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territory would be freed as of January 1st, 1863. The Confederacy correctly interpreted this as an ultimatum, surrender or lose slavery, and rejected it outright. Palmerston, recognizing the shift, abandoned open support for the South. Meanwhile, Lincoln had another pressing issue. McClellan had to go. As commander-in-chief, Lincoln had the authority to remove him, but McClellan's widespread popularity among soldiers and the press, as well as his political ambitions, made dismissal politically hazardous. Simply firing him was out of the question, despite mounting pressure from Lincoln's cabinet. McClellan refused any reassignment away from his army and aspired to reclaim the role of general-in-chief. Lincoln initially attempted to circumvent the problem by merging the Army of the Potomac with the Army of Virginia. But General John Pope's disastrous defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run rendered that plan unworkable. Moreover, the Union's pool of experienced senior generals capable of leading independent commands was alarmingly shallow. McClellan's tenure had proven that the role of general-in-chief should not be held by someone also commanding an active field army, which ruled out Henry Halleck. Several successful generals were fighting in the Western Theater, but Pope's failure made transferring another officer east an unappealing prospect. That left Ambrose Burnside. Though he had led a successful joint Army-Navy operation in the Carolinas, capturing Pamlico Sound, he doubted his own qualifications for high command. Lincoln first offered him McClellan's position in July 1862, but Burnside refused, citing his inexperience and the ongoing reorganization of his forces into the Army of the Potomac's Ninth Corps. After Pope's defeat, Lincoln again approached Burnside, and again he declined. When Antietam confirmed Burnside's self-doubts, Lincoln attempted a different approach. He removed General Don Carlos Buell from command of the Army of the Ohio on October 24, 1862, hoping this would send a message to McClellan. Yet McClellan remained defiant. With no other option, Lincoln relieved him of command on November 5, 1862. Burnside was ordered to take control of the Army of the Potomac before McClellan's dismissal became official. Declining the command once again would not have saved McClellan, but it would have meant that Joseph Hooker, whom Burnside considered even less suitable for leadership, would become the next choice. Reluctantly, Burnside accepted and met with General-in-Chief Henry Halleck on November 7th, where he learned that he was expected to plan an immediate offensive. The Republican Party had suffered significant losses in the midterm elections, and Union morale was at an all-time low. Action was needed to restore confidence and boost enlistment. This directive unsettled Burnside, who had hoped for time to acclimate to his new role and refine his planned spring campaign. However, time was a luxury he would not be afforded. By November 9th, he presented his strategy to Halleck. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was divided. Stonewall Jackson's corps was in the Shenandoah Valley. James Longstreet was positioned near Culpeper, and J.B. Stuart's cavalry patrolled the area between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, ensuring that any Union advance down the traditional invasion routes would be met with aggressive flanking attacks. To circumvent this, Burnside planned to outmaneuver Lee by crossing the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg using pontoon bridges. His forces would then utilize the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad as a supply line to advance swiftly toward Richmond. To mislead Lee, the Union Army would initially concentrate at Warrenton, drawing Confederate attention away from potential crossing points. Meanwhile, Union cavalry would probe toward Gordonsville and Culpeper to create further distractions. Once deception was achieved, the entire army would make a forced march to Fredericksburg, using feints and diversionary maneuvers to obscure its true movements. By the time Lee realized the ruse, Burnside would already be across the river, positioned behind Confederate lines. Lincoln harbored doubts about the likelihood of deceiving Lee, but found the overall strategy sound. On November 14th, he approved the plan, stressing that its success hinged entirely on speed. While awaiting official approval, Burnside undertook a major restructuring of his command. Managing 8 corps and 120,000 troops proved unwieldy, so he consolidated them into 4 grand divisions. The right, center, left, and reserve, led respectively by Edwin Sumner, Joseph Hooker, William Franklin, and Franz Sigel. However, resentment brewed among officers who had been loyal to McClellan. Burnside was perceived as an outsider with limited command experience, and his leadership was met with skepticism. Shortly after receiving Lincoln's authorization, Burnside was informed that the pontoon bridges were ready, and he ordered the army to begin its forced march on November 15th. Sumner arrived in Falmouth by November 17th and discovered that Fredericksburg was defended by a mere 500 Confederate troops. Seeing an opportunity, he requested permission to immediately ford the Rappahannock and seize the town. However, heavy autumn rains had swollen the river, making a crossing perilous. Fearing that Sumner's corps might become isolated and face Lee's counterattack alone, Burnside ordered him to wait for the pontoons, which were expected to arrive later that evening. Unbeknownst to Burnside, the pontoons were still sitting in their assembly yards upriver from Washington. The message sent on November 14th had stated that the bridges were completed, but it omitted a critical detail. There were no horses available to transport them. Burnside had not been informed of this logistical failure. Neither the quartermaster general nor Halleck prioritized the movement of the pontoons until Burnside's chief engineer inquired about them on November 17th. Despite Burnside having formally requested the pontoons on November 6th and holding multiple discussions with Halleck about their necessity, the first pontoons did not begin moving until November 19th. To make matters worse, the predicted heavy rains further impeded their overland transport, forcing them to be laboriously transferred to riverboats. Despite Lincoln's skepticism about Burnside's ability to deceive Lee, the Confederate general had been thoroughly misled. Expecting an attack near Brandy Station or Sperryville, Lee was caught off guard when the Army of the Potomac vanished from sight. Stuart's cavalry was unable to locate the Union force north or south of Warrenton, leaving Confederate headquarters scrambling to determine its next move. In response, Lee dispersed his forces along the Rappahannock and extended his search down to the James River. On November 19th, word finally reached Lee that Federal troops had appeared near Fredericksburg. Assuming Burnside had already crossed the river, Lee prepared defensive positions along the North Anna River. However, Confederate President Jefferson Davis urged him to engage further from Richmond to maintain civilian morale. Longstreet arrived at Fredericksburg on November 23rd, only to find that the Union Army remained on the northern bank of the Rappahannock. Burnside had refused repeated requests from his subordinates to ford the river at alternative points, as fluctuating water levels made the crossings unpredictable. Instead, he staged feints and gunboat probes at multiple locations, keeping Lee uncertain of where the main attack would come while awaiting the arrival of his engineers. The first pontoons reached the Union lines on November 25th, but Burnside refused to cross with only one bridge in place. From his vantage point on Stafford Heights, he could see Confederate sharpshooters positioned in Fredericksburg, backed by artillery that could reach the river crossings. What he did not realize was that he faced only Longstreet's command. Lee, Jackson, and Stuart were still days away. Even so, Burnside feared that attempting to funnel his entire army across a single crossing point would lead to a catastrophic slaughter. He waited until December 1st for all 6 pontoon bridges to be assembled. By then, his subordinates had grown increasingly disillusioned, warning him that continuing the campaign would be disastrous. Lee's army, now reinforced to 72,000 men, had entrenched itself along the heights outside Fredericksburg. Reconnaissance revealed that every viable crossing point was now fortified, while Union artillery on Stafford Heights could clear the valley of Confederate skirmishers. It was unable to reach the elevated Confederate positions on Marye's Heights. Any attempt to storm the ridges would be suicidal. Yet, political pressure left Burnside with little choice. Lincoln and his administration needed a military victory to regain public confidence, and the stalled offensive was undermining Union morale. Burnside also believed that Lee's forces had been dangerously stretched. With 2 Confederate divisions stationed east at Skinner's Neck, he was convinced that Fredericksburg's defenders were too thinly spread to withstand an assault from his 120,000-strong army. Thus, on December 9th, he issued the orders for the attack. Under the cover of darkness, Union engineers labored to construct pontoon bridges. Sumner's Grand Division would be the first to cross, swiftly securing Fredericksburg. Meanwhile, Franklin was to cross further downstream, seize Prospect Hill, and turn the Confederate flank. Once the Confederate line began to collapse, Sumner would launch a full-scale assault, driving the enemy south toward Richmond. Hooker's Grand Division would remain in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthroughs. Although no general fully supported the plan, they reluctantly moved into position on December 10th. That night, the engineers began their work. By late morning on December 11th, 3 of the downstream bridges were completed, yet Franklin did not commence his crossing until late afternoon and did not finish until 1 p.m. on December 12th. Meanwhile, Confederate sharpshooters obstructed the construction of the upstream bridges, forcing the Union artillery to intervene. A massive 150-gun barrage devastated Fredericksburg, but it failed to dislodge the defenders. It was only after Colonel Norman Hall's brigade stormed across the river, engaging in fierce street combat, that the town was secured, allowing the engineers to complete their work. Sumner's troops finally began crossing at 4:30 p.m., fanning out into the smoldering ruins of Fredericksburg, where they systematically eliminated remaining sharpshooters, many of whom had sought refuge in buildings. Looting soon followed. By December 12th, both armies had moved into position. Lee recalled his dispersed forces and established a defensive line along the ridges west of Fredericksburg, fortifying his position with trenches and a stone wall along the sunken road at Marye's Heights. Despite surveying the battlefield, Burnside delayed issuing attack orders until the following day. Franklin had expected to launch an all-out assault at dawn with his entire Grand Division. However, his orders, issued only at 7:30 a.m., were surprisingly cautious. Instead of the bold offensive outlined on December 9th, he was instructed merely to seize Prospect Hill with 1 or more divisions and hold his forces in reserve, prepared to engage further if necessary. The ambiguity of these weakly worded orders led Franklin to proceed conservatively. Once the morning fog lifted, he committed only George Meade's division, supported by John Gibbon's division. The Confederates reacted swiftly. J.B. Stuart's horse artillery initially stalled Meade's advance until the famed Iron Brigade drove them back at 11 a.m. Jackson's artillery then opened fire, halting the Union attack until counter-battery fire suppressed the guns by 1 p.m. Meade's 4,500 troops faced a daunting task, opposing Jackson's 36,000, but the rugged terrain unexpectedly worked in their favor. A natural gap in Jackson's defensive line provided Meade with an opportunity. He exploited the weakness, charged through, and managed to rout 2 Confederate brigades, temporarily breaking Jackson's front. Gibbon's attack, however, met fierce resistance from well-prepared Confederate defenses. Though his men fought their way to the crest of the ridgeline, they suffered heavy casualties. Despite the breakthrough, Franklin failed to commit reinforcements. This allowed Jubal Early's Confederate forces to regroup and counterattack, repelling Meade's troops. Federal artillery then halted Early's counteroffensive, but the moment for a decisive Union breakthrough had passed. The situation on the upstream front proved even more disastrous. Sumner was ordered to probe Marye's Heights with a single division. However, when this force was decimated by pre-sighted Confederate artillery and Longstreet's entrenched infantry, Sumner escalated the attack into a full-scale assault at 1 p.m. Wave after wave of Union soldiers advanced across the open fields, only to be mercilessly cut down. No Federal troops came within 40 yards of the Confederate stone wall. Despite fierce objections from his generals, Burnside ordered Hooker's Grand Division forward at 3:30 p.m., condemning yet another wave of men to a futile assault. The slaughter only ended when nightfall mercifully brought the battle to a close. By the end of the day, Confederate casualties stood at 5,377, mostly from Jackson's sector. Union losses were staggering, with 12,653 men killed, wounded, or missing in what Lincoln later described not as a battle, but as butchery. On December 14th, Burnside requested and was granted a truce to recover the wounded. Some officers advocated for holding Fredericksburg as a base for future operations, but strategically, the town was worthless as long as Lee commanded the heights. Burnside ordered a withdrawal across the Rappahannock the next day. The Army of the Potomac was left demoralized, and desertion surged. Determined to redeem himself, Burnside attempted a bold maneuver on January 20th, planning to outflank Lee by crossing the Rappahannock at U.S. Ford. However, relentless winter rains turned the roads into a muddy quagmire, rendering artillery movement impossible. The ill-fated operation, later dubbed the Mud March, proved to be Burnside's final humiliation. By this point, officer insubordination had reached an alarming level. Some brigadiers abandoned their posts to personally appeal to Lincoln and Washington, openly defying Burnside's authority. Furious, Burnside demanded the power to dismiss disloyal generals. Halleck, while recommending court-martials for insubordination, confirmed their complaints. The Army had lost all confidence in its commander. Lincoln faced a stark choice: either purge the officer corps or remove Burnside. On January 26th, the president met with Burnside, who bitterly vented his frustrations, insisting he had been undermined at every turn before offering his resignation. Lincoln accepted and reassigned him to the Western Theater. Burnside had reached the limits of his competence and lasted just 2 months in command. With Burnside gone, Joseph Hooker assumed leadership. An experienced officer familiar with the Army of the Potomac, he was popular among the troops, immediately boosting morale. However, his aggressive and brash personality, along with his reputation as a womanizer, alienated many senior officers, some of whom resigned in protest. This allowed Hooker to dismantle Burnside's cumbersome Grand Division structure and promote fresh talent to Corps command. He also consolidated all Union cavalry into a single corps under George Stoneman and established the Bureau of Military Information, the first formal intelligence unit in U.S. military history. Hooker swiftly enacted reforms. He launched extensive corruption investigations into the quartermaster and medical departments, improved living conditions, upgraded rations, and instituted more rigorous training for both soldiers and officers. He also recognized a critical strategic lesson from Burnside's failure. Lee was vulnerable to deception and would detach forces in response to feints. Lincoln had concluded that Lee's army, rather than Richmond itself, was the true objective. Hooker agreed. Intelligence reports from the BMI revealed that Lee heavily guarded the Rappahannock, but left its northernmost flank under the watch of Stuart's cavalry alone. Hooker devised a plan to exploit this weakness. First, in early February, he redeployed the 9th Corps to Fort Monroe, prompting Lee to dispatch Longstreet with 2 divisions to counter the move. In April, Union cavalry would execute a deep raid to sever Lee's supply lines and lure away Stuart's forces. Meanwhile, John Sedgwick's 3 Corps would cross the Rappahannock south of Fredericksburg, diverting Lee's attention while the rest of the army swung west across the Rapidan River to envelop him. If executed correctly, Lee would be forced to either retreat toward Richmond or engage the Union Army under Hooker's terms. The success of this plan hinged on quickly clearing the wilderness, a dense expanse of tangled undergrowth that severely restricted movement and communication. Hooker aimed to draw Lee into open terrain, where superior Union numbers and firepower could decisively crush the Confederates. Stoneman's cavalry raid was scheduled to begin on April 13th, but nature once again intervened. Torrential spring rains rendered roads impassable and the Rappahannock unfordable, delaying the operation. A second attempt on April 30th also faltered, with only John Buford's brigade managing to reach its objective. Buford's men successfully severed the Orange and Alexandria Railroad near Gordonsville on May 2nd, destroying Confederate supply trains and skirmishing with Stuart's cavalry before withdrawing. However, by then, the raid had failed to meaningfully disrupt Lee's operations. With Confederate attention still fixed on Hooker, the Union Army launched its main advance on April 27th. By April 30th, Hooker established his headquarters in the small crossroads hamlet of Chancellorsville, deep within the wilderness. Meanwhile, Sedgwick's force began its crossing on April 28th, marching toward Fredericksburg. The climactic confrontation between Hooker and Lee was about to unfold. By May 1st, Hooker had positioned 70,000 men around Chancellorsville, with Sedgwick commanding 27,000 across the river and another 15,000 remaining near Falmouth. Initially, Stuart found himself cut off by Stoneman's cavalry raid, but he quickly maneuvered past the slow-moving Union troopers and discovered Hooker's movements, reporting them to Lee on April 30th. Lee, concluding that Sedgwick's force was merely a diversion, decided to largely ignore him. Instead, he boldly divided his army, leaving Jubal early with 11,000 men to hold the Fredericksburg fortifications while taking the remaining 40,000 to confront Hooker. Longstreet and half of his divisions were too far south to participate in the battle. Lee's closest division to Hooker was entrenched between the Zoan and Tabernacle churches. Jackson arrived at 11 a.m. on May 1st and ordered them to join his advance against Hooker. At the same time, Hooker began pushing out of the wilderness. The two forces collided at the forest's edge around 11:20 a.m. A chaotic engagement followed, with both lines riddled with gaps. As the Union forces attempted to consolidate, Meade's V Corps advanced along River Road, threatening Jackson's flank. However, Hooker abruptly halted the advance and ordered his men to withdraw. Fearing another debacle like Fredericksburg and unwilling to risk a full-scale engagement, he chose to fall back into a defensive posture. It was a decision Lee and Jackson would exploit mercilessly. That evening, Stuart reported that while the Union left was securely anchored on the Rappahannock, the right flank was dangerously exposed, floating unsupported along the Orange Turnpike. Even better, a newly constructed road provided a concealed route around Hooker's position, completely hidden from Union observation. Seizing the opportunity, Lee and Jackson devised an audacious plan. Meanwhile, Hooker realized that Sedgwick's demonstrations had failed to draw Confederate forces away. To strengthen his left, he ordered the I Corps to move from Fredericksburg, but the message was delayed and did not arrive until after dawn. The reinforcements would be too late. At first light, Jackson began moving 28,000 men in secrecy, leaving Lee with only 13,000 to keep Hooker occupied. Although Union pickets and observation balloons detected Confederate movements, they could not determine their purpose. Hooker suspected a flanking maneuver and warned the 11th Corps. However, their commander, General Oliver Howard, falsely assured him that they were prepared. Confident in this, Hooker ordered Sedgwick to attack and sent Sickles' 3 Corps forward to probe Lee's defenses. Sickles stumbled upon Jackson's rear guard, capturing some troops but missing the main column, which had already slipped past 11th Corps, fully encircling it. Although some Union units sensed the danger, no alarm was raised. At 5:30 p.m., Jackson unleashed his assault. Most of the 11th Corps was caught completely off guard, preparing dinner when the eerie Confederate battle cry, the rebel yell, pierced the evening air. A few regiments had taken the earlier warnings seriously and put up resistance, but they were quickly overwhelmed as the entire 11th Corps collapsed in disarray. Seeing his soldiers fleeing in panic, Hooker mounted his horse and rode among them, desperately trying to rally his shattered right flank. He ordered his old division to form a new defensive line, while artillery was repositioned at Fairview Cemetery to slow the Confederate advance. The Confederates pressed forward for more than a mile, but the combination of growing darkness and the dense wilderness terrain caused their attack to lose cohesion. That night, Sickles withdrew to Hazel Grove. Jackson, eager to press the attack under the full moon, rode out to reconnoiter the Union lines. In a tragic twist of fate, he mistakenly returned through Confederate lines from the wrong direction. His own men, mistaking him for enemy cavalry, opened fire. Jackson was struck 3 times. During the chaotic retreat of his staff, A.P. Hill was also wounded by artillery fire. Jackson's left arm was amputated, but pneumonia soon set in. He succumbed to his illness on May 10th. With Jackson incapacitated, Stuart assumed command of his corps, but found himself separated from Lee due to Sickles' strong position at Hazel Grove, which exposed Stuart's forces to a potential counterattack. Lee struggled to find a way to reunite his army until Hooker inadvertently solved the problem for him. He ordered Sickles to withdraw to tighten the Union line. Seizing the opportunity, Stuart immediately occupied Hazel Grove, turning it into a critical artillery position. From this vantage point, he bombarded Union forces and drove Hooker back toward US 4 by noon. During the engagement, Hooker was concussed by artillery shrapnel and became increasingly ineffective as a commander. Lee prepared to deliver the final blow with a massed assault, but before he could act, news arrived that Sedgwick had successfully stormed Marye's Heights and was advancing. After 2 failed frontal attacks, Union forces had outflanked the stone wall, inflicting heavy losses on its Confederate defenders and avenging their slaughter at the First Battle of Fredericksburg. With Sedgwick now threatening his rear, Lee once again divided his army, believing Hooker to be decisively beaten. Hooker, largely incapacitated, failed to provide any clear orders. As a result, Lee led 20,000 men to reinforce Early and attacked Sedgwick near Salem Church. Lacking support from Hooker, Sedgwick was forced to retreat across the Rappahannock on May 5th. Throughout the ordeal, Hooker's war council urged him to stand and fight, but in a moment of delirium, he overruled them and ordered a full withdrawal. The retreat was completed on May 6th, and Stoneman's cavalry rejoined the army the next day. In many ways, Chancellorsville was Lee's finest battlefield performance. He repeatedly divided his army against superior numbers, outmaneuvering his opponent through boldness, superior reconnaissance, and unmatched morale. Against Hooker, he achieved a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Against Sedgwick, he leveraged superior numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and decisive maneuvering to crush the Union offensive. Every quality that made Robert E. Lee one of history's greatest battlefield commanders was on full display. Yet, not all saw it as a triumph. Upon rejoining the army, Longstreet openly criticized Lee's reckless tactics. The loss of Jackson, Longstreet argued, was as devastating as losing half the army. Even had he survived, the staggering casualties were unsustainable. Hooker had suffered approximately 17,200 casualties, including 4,000 captured. Lee's losses totaled 13,300, with 2,000 missing or captured. Discounting those unaccounted for, casualties were nearly equal. However, while Hooker could replenish his ranks, Lee could not. In the grand scheme, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville were tactically brilliant but strategically hollow victories. Despite 2 resounding battlefield triumphs, Lee found himself in the same position as in 1861, with the Army of Northern Virginia increasingly worn down by attrition. Lee may have felt the weight of Longstreet's words, for he now turned his thoughts toward a new campaign, one that would either bring decisive victory or seal the Confederacy's fate.